Everyone, and welcome to our webinar, which is focused on a reflection of the Perry Preschool Project and the Chicago Longitudinal Study. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Karen Bierman. I'm a steering committee member of the Big Ten Early Learning Alliance and an Evan Pugh University professor at Penn State University. And today, I'm joined by my colleague, Janelle, who's monitoring our chat box. She'll be doing some housekeeping information there. I'm delighted today that we're going to have presentations by two other members of the Early Learning Alliance Steering Committee. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Early Learning Alliance before I introduce them. It was launched officially in 2023, and the goal was to bring together experts from the 14 universities that are part of the Big Ten. Just recently, we've expanded to include the West Coast schools. The overall mission of the Alliance is to strengthen early childhood policies and practices through science. Currently, the Alliance is funded by a gift from the American Family Insurance to our organizers at the Crane Center at Ohio State University. All right, let's move on to today's event. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Steve Barnett. He's going to talk about his past work on the Perry Preschool Project. And after that, we'll learn from Dr. Arthur Reynolds on the Chicago Longitudinal Studies. I'll provide a little bit of commentary after we've listened to both talks, and then we'll move on to some Q&A time with participation from the audience. So let me turn things over first to Dr. Steve Barnett.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks everyone who's joined us. Delighted to be here. I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. These are huge longitudinal studies in terms of the scope of the research that's been conducted over many decades. So we're just going to be able to talk about a few aspects of it. And I wanted to talk from two perspectives. First, about why the Perry Preschool Study has been so important, I think, reflecting back on it. And then a couple of key points about the study that I think are not well understood. So I'm going to share my screen here in order to give you some visuals on this. Okay, so going back to the beginning. Why is the Perry Preschool Study so influential? I focused on 6 explanations. One is the audacity of preschool special education director, who, with his school principal and some others, was concerned about the limited school success of children from very disadvantaged backgrounds in the early 1960s in their schools, frustrated with the ability of the schools to do something to make further progress, and said, well, what if we get them before school? How about a preschool program? I think it's hard to get in the frame of thinking that in 1960, when they started planning this, the reaction was, you can't take kids away from their moms for 2.5 hours. You will ruin their lives. It's a very different mindset than we'd have today. The idea that you do a randomized trial with that, I think, was audacious. The simplicity of a randomized trial setup, here's a program. One group gets it, one group doesn't. Let's compare them and follow them. Intensity, both the intensity of the preschool program, which I'll talk about, and the intensity of the research effort, which was qualitative and quantitative and really in depth, in and broad in terms of the development of the whole child. Uh, Validity, both in the sense of using strong, valid measures of children's learning and development over time, but also in the sense of consequential validity of measuring things that mattered in the real world: school success, social success, economic success. Uh, Tenacity. Um, there were many other early childhood programs and studies that are similar to Perry uh, that have not had its influence. And partly that's because many of them, after a short few years, don't have the follow-up. So the sample, the fact that most of the kids are found at age 19, 27, 40, and beyond uh, is really a mark of remarkable tenacity. And finally, relevancy. This goes back to the issue of measuring things that matter, both in terms of the treatment and the consequences. And part of that is work that I participated in as an economist starting at the age 19 follow-up with trying to put an economic value on both the cost of the program and the consequences. And that's not something that's often done. And I think you'll see that most, if not all, of these characteristics are replicated in the Chicago Longitudinal Study, which helps to explain also its influence. Now, I think there's a fair amount of misunderstanding about what the Perry Preschool program was. Was a half-day preschool program provided by the public school at ages 3 and 4, though not always in a public school building. When they got started, I think they were in a basement somewhere. One teacher for every 6 or 7 children, 2 teachers with a larger group of children. Sometimes they might have even operated with 4 teachers in a large group, although I think that was relatively rare. But they were all teachers, right? They're fully qualified, not in the sense of having an early childhood certification, because that didn't exist, but these were regular public school teachers in terms of their qualifications. There were weekly home visits. They were designed as 90-minute private weekly lessons. That's the description by Norma Radin, who designed the home visit program. She was a professor at the University of Michigan. Parents were observers or participants. There was a lot of one-to-one tutoring going on in these sessions. That's what they were designed to do. Yet they were designed to get the parent engaged and to learn about children's learning and development and what they could do. But this was hands-on, one-to-one tutoring. There were no comprehensive services, right? I hear this a lot. Perry provided those 2 components. That's what they got. All right. They tried some other things. For example, father participation meetings. They got very little participation on those and dropped them. If you look at what they did in the classroom, Dave Weichert, who had been a Marine, described it as verbal bombardment. There was a huge emphasis on vocabulary, on strong cognitive development, generally including representation and executive functions, plan, do, review, and mathematics. There was an extraordinarily rich team that worked on this. Connie Camille, who worked on the curriculum, had been a postdoc with Piaget. Norma Radin, as I mentioned, was a professor at University of Michigan. 2 well-known figures in early childhood today who were teachers were Louise Derman Sparks and Evelyn Moore. There were great teachers in this program. And so I also want to say just a little bit about the consequences. There have been a lot said about cognitive fade out, non-cognitive effects, a term that I hate as an economist to see my fellow economists use. They're all cognitive. Uh, there are different types of cognitive measures and domains. Um, and in general, IQ, including the PPVT, which is what they measured in the during the program, and continuing measured afterwards, you can see how they have huge impacts, a full standard deviation. And these decline rapidly. When they start measuring achievement, you see a very different pattern, right? If anything, there's an increase. But it really is hard to, and I'm not sure I would make much about those differences across the years, other than typically the first year you test kids on a standardized achievement test. They don't do as well as when they've had experience. But impacts about a third of a standard deviation persist. And there are other measures measuring adult skills that find the same things. These do not fade out, right? And this is a different story than you see in other kinds of other studies of preschool. Almost all of those are studies of the impact of 1 year of a program that's not nearly as intensive as 2 years of Perry, even though it was a half-day program. And if I take results from our study of the Abbott preschool program in New Jersey, implemented with high needs urban population in our state, which I think at full scale ongoing public program statewide, probably the closest thing to Perry. It's not, it's more intensive in some ways, in the sense that it's a full day for 2 years beginning at age 3. Maximum class size of 15, which is not too far off, and certified, well-paid public school teachers. But in this case, with assistance as the second adult in the classroom. And you can see persistent effects on language arts and literacy, about a third of its standard deviation, about 0.3, the same thing on mathematics. And again, the no fade out story here. If we look at other kinds of impacts, you can see, right, they're doing more homework, for example, in middle school. There's persistence on these kinds of things as well. As we move to social behavior and crime, the impacts are evident in teacher ratings of kids. This is called discipline problems. But you could think of it as various kinds of misbehavior or antisocial behavior that kids engage in beginning in first grade, kindergarten, and impacts are evident throughout that. So again, it's not that there's this disappearance or sleeper effects and these things come back later. There's this persistent chain of effects all through parent. And now I'm going to pass it on to Arthur.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, it's great. I really like the history there, the rendition. And I would say, in my case, the Chicago Longitudinal Study, which I've directed for like 40 years. One thing I just want to say reinforces what Steve found. I'm not going to share a lot of findings from the CLS. You can kind of see those out there, but again, in a sense, those findings that you just showed on sort of the lab, there's no fade out on achievement effects. Our study, really perfectly, sort of validated and extended those findings, directly where, if you look at reading and math achievement through high school graduation rates, you're seeing strong effects, of the program. And again, it's not a run-of-the-mill program either, the child parent centers. And I think what I would describe the child parent centers as, as an intervention model is that in some ways, it's almost a perfect marriage between sort of, a comprehensive sort of educational enrichment in sort of literacy and math with a very strong emphasis on parent involvement, getting parents involved in school, providing that social support system. They effectively married those two components like no other program I've seen, including Head Start, because parent involvement was really a strong requirement, really an expectation and a requirement in the program as well. And they build a system of, a parent resource room, family resource room, sort of a system of supportive services that were comprehensive, that provided that sort of wraparound, but really, embedded within a strong literacy, language, oral language, especially, sort of development over time. So I think that sort of it's hard to sort of bottle and replicate that. And I think that's the challenge we have in scale up of programs. But I think there's some lessons that I do want to share on our work, because in some ways, hopefully everyone can see this. In some ways, Chicago Longitudinal Study, we've tried to go, farther in understanding some of the lessons from the work and the program in terms of how do you do long-term follow-up studies? What's the value of cohort studies and the like? And so I want to take this from a perspective that I think we've drawn sort of 7 implications for early childhood research based on our work in the Child Parent Center program and also in the Chicago Longitudinal Study. I just want to say, as a director of the program, so my involvement as a director, so, we did not design the Child Parent Center program. So at least the initial version. Now, the scale-up version, we did design it in the expansion of the Child Parent Center. It's called the Midwest Child Parent Expansion. And I was heavily involved in that as well. So I think we looked at this as a sort of a partner in helping the school district really identify and the field identify what works in early childhood programs and how to scale it. Okay, so these are the lessons perspective. Now I want to one thing I do want to look at the history here, that there's a rich history in the health sciences for these long-term community cohort studies. Think of the Framingham Heart Study in the 50s, a major contribution. There were really no community cohort studies in education until Perry and Susan Gray's study and other studies kind of developed in the 60s and 70s as well. So I think Perry and CPC have created a new class of sort of cohort studies, lifelong cohort studies that are based in the community and schools that really intensively follow up participants over time to better understand their whole experience and what the impact of the programs are, but also the factors that might promote effects. So I think that's really important. So I think of this new class of cohort studies, I think it's really important. But if we think about today, though, the challenge of doing these kinds of studies for all the state pre-K programs, all kinds of programs that we have out there, there's downsides. If we were to do the CLS study over again, it would be very difficult to do it again. I think that would be the same case in Perry. The cost and commitment is really important, and one must be in it for the long haul when you're doing these follow-up studies. You've got to take a really serious approach. And the costs are exorbitant and much more exorbitant now. But I think the partnerships can overcome them. Both Perry and CPC started in school districts, part of school system, and I think that support system that was already present made them be successful or really encourage that. But of course, the advantages you see, a holistic understanding of life course development. But in the Chicago Longitudinal Study, if we look at the child parent centers, now, let's face it. Now, I love the history of Perry, but if you think about it, the CPC project in the Chicago Longitudinal Study, it's the largest and longest running study of early childhood impacts in the United States by far, because we have the sample of over 1,500. We followed them for 40 years. Obviously, that's not to take anything away from Perry. They started earlier. They're over 50 now, but the fact is we have a huge sample, and it's been challenging to kind of follow them over time. But if you think about it, they're age, 44 now. If you think about like, what are they doing now? 45 years old. You saw that photo, I think from the session as well, a focus group we did. But again, we have followed 91.2% of the original samples available for follow-up. Very similar to Perry. They're amazing. That's amazingly successful. These kids were born in 1980. Now, only thing I would say about design, it's it's a matched group design. It's not a randomized controlled trial because the program was already proven in the 80s to be effective. So it would not have been ethically feasible or even useful to do a randomized controlled trial. So the next best design, really the best, most ecologically valid design, was to do a matched group design, a quasi-experimental design, where we took all the kids in the CPCs that attended all the centers, all the 20 centers, and compared them to kids getting the usual early childhood experiences in the same neighborhoods. It's sort of a complete saturation. But again, at the same time, the CPCs were put in the highest poverty neighborhoods, so it's hard to find like an identical, group. The group tended to be more advantaged than the comparison group. So again, there's probably a conservative bias that this design sets up because the comparison group got a ton of services that wouldn't normally be expected. Like full day kindergarten just did not exist in the mid 80s. And that's what all the comparison group got, 15% at Head Start. So again, this is a really strong design, and all the analysis we've done over the years shows that, no matter how you look at this, these are strong, enduring effects. And it's also led to innovations in analytic methods I want to mention as well. So that's the study. So what are my implications? Because let's think about it. How many studies of 1,500, whatever, over 45 years have this kind of recovery rate? We've had probably over 50 people in the Chicago Longitudinal Study working with me and others, including, on the steering committee, Judy Temple, Sue O. So what are the lessons? So we do sort of know what we're doing on this. I think the same for Perry. So how do you design cohort studies to kind of have the success and the influence today into the future that we can kind of, help guide? So here's my 7 implications. I'm just going to give you a couple examples in the time that I have. And I think one of the things, Steve mentioned this a little bit, that I think the value now is understanding the health and well-being of families and children. It isn't about improving IQ or even school achievement. It's a much bigger story. And so I think it's not a focus on achievement, because back in the 60s and 70s, we're all kind of suffering from sort of the environmental naivism that we could increase IQ scores by 50 points. And I think now we think about this in a more interesting, useful way, feasible way, and looking at the outcomes. And it's really health and well-being. It could be diet and exercise, cardiovascular health, career expectations, things like that. So actually, that's the value. So we should follow the data that way. If we consider a lifespan orientation, obviously both studies have done that, at least partially by looking beyond the pre-K years and looking at program development. Taking an interdisciplinary approach is absolutely essential. Data collection plan must be rigorous, utilize all sources, but also take costs into account. So those are the first 4 really implications that we should think about that I think would help us. The other thing that we've done, I think, successfully is to leverage all aspects of your study as much as possible for the benefit of the field of policy and the like. I'll show you a couple examples of that. And obviously, there's advances in innovation in measures and methods and research approaches. And I'll just put a plug in. The first study in early childhood research to do, the double correction where you're through inverse propensity score weighting, a double correction where you're looking at a possible attrition bias and selection bias at the same time. Our study was the first one to ever do that in 2011. And it's because of, we want to be able to understand, enhance the validity of the project as much as possible. If we would have had an RCD, we never would have done the study because we wouldn't need it. But the fact that we felt we wanted extra validity, we did it, and so that is the one innovation. And obviously a focus on the mechanisms of change, because obviously if we want to scale up population, every child have access to Perry Preschool Program or child parent centers, that we need to understand what makes them work. What are the mechanisms of effects? So we did all. So those are really, I think, the foci. Let me just have a couple ones, kind of the point on. and the lifespan perspective, I just want to make a pitch on. So I'll take three probably of these implications and give you kind of a sense, an example. So follow the lifespan perspective is really important. You can't age out of these studies at age 9 or 10. You got to really go into them. And I think that's a lesson for a lot of the state pre-K programs today. Here's our model of like why you should look at these long-term effects. And the only thing I would say, you could look at that. But again, we developed the 5 hypothesis model really as understanding the mechanisms by which long-term effects can be achieved, not only in education, but in physical health. This will be posted on our HCRC website, because I also direct with Judy Temple, the Human Capital Research Collaborative, University of Minnesota. So you can look at this figure more, but we've made a lot of kind of validating our findings against this 5 hypothesis model, which we've also tested with Perry and a posteriori as well. It pretty much checks out. But cost-benefit analysis is a lifespan perspective. So if you look at the influence of the 2 projects, I would say go back to the 2013 State of the Union address by President Obama. Preschool for All initiative, he highlighted the $7 return. Those numbers came from Perry and CPC. And it's partly because they're addressing all domains of well-being, and they took a lifespan perspective. And that's partly why they've been so influential. And of course, don't stop at pre-K. That's the only thing I'm going to say. Think of this in a pre-K, a first decade perspective. We sort of identified that concept, long time ago. I think it's true. And you see these elements, the key elements of the CPC program that we redeveloped and sort of expanded into a school reform model. I won't dwell on this, but that's the key arrow. It's probably my favorite figure of all time. So an interdisciplinary approach is essential. And let me just say, so what fields have we worked on? I'm actually, by training, an interdisciplinary scientist in public policy analysis with education emphasis. But again, Judy's an economist, Sue is a social welfare expert. But we were influenced by all these fields tremendously. And we learned from all these fields in doing our studies. We wouldn't have had anywhere near the interest in collecting everything we did if we only were interested in psychology or education or economics by itself. We want to think of this in an interdisciplinary way. That's a lot of fields, including history, because I love the history of early childhood programs. And for example, the scope is, we do lately a lot of research. A lot of our research is published in health journals, medical science journals, JAMA Pediatrics, because we're looking at health outcomes. And here's a great one of the American Heart Association Life Simple 7 Index that we find positive effects on. And you can read about that as well. So you're not going to read this in Early Child Research Quarterly or Child Development, because we believe in this, the strongly interdisciplinary perspective of early childhood programs and their lifelong effects. And so that's a plug for interdisciplinary. Now here's probably the hardest thing. Maybe one of the most important things is make a rigorous data collection plan. Now, I'm going to go fast on this, but there's a reason I'm going fast on this, okay, about what we've collected. So here's what we collected in the CLS. You can read that. I'll just say 3 things: birth records, program data, head teacher survey, 11 consecutive years of district test scores, 8 consecutive years of teacher surveys, 3 parent surveys, 4 student surveys through 6th grade, a high school student survey twice, qualitative project with 100 participants, 3 adult surveys of our participants, health exam and biomarkers with Northwestern, COVID survey, and that's not even administrative data. Add all these other records, juvenile records. We got to go into the juvenile courts and manually search records to see if, there's child abuse and neglect or, criminal history in some of the projects. Employment and income, higher ed records, GED, public aid, census data, school report card data, Social Security deductions, address and participant tracking. Think about it. Now, my conclusion is that we collected way too much data. We did, some ways, looking back, it was crazy to collect that much data. And I wouldn't expect any project to kind of do that today. We could never do that today. Because we have things like Social Security numbers and confidentiality that we could never do today as well. And so I'm thinking that think small, think much smaller in designing new projects as well. And the other thing too, we're lost in a sea of data in a lot of ways as well, even though we have like 50 people that work on the CLS project. But I think a rule is follow the good enough rule in new cohort studies. Establish a core plan based on goals, expertise, and capacity to get high response rates. Take advantage of available data, archive everything, follow data security, but really do a good enough job. Don't collect 20 times as much data that you actually need as we did. So that's my advice to the future. So last thing, I'm probably at 15 minutes. Leverage, maybe the most important thing is leverage the knowledge in these projects. Now, you can't really leverage a cross-sectional study. I think you can leverage Perry and CPC because there's a foundation of massive interest in program and data. Here's some of the leveraging we've done in the CLS. We got a chance to redo the CPC study, the CLS study in the Midwest CPC expansion project. It's even larger than the CLS study, but it's mainly secondary data. So we created a scale up of the CPC program that I developed with districts. And so obviously that has had a big input. And that project is ongoing and kids are in high school. Based on the CLS, we helped Chicago and St. Paul go to a full day pre-K model. Both districts had no full day pre-K in 2012 when we started the I3, this expansion project. Now it's nearly universal in both districts. A SIB Pay for Success, the Social Impact Bond Pay for Success project in the city of Chicago used the CPC model. It was based on CLS and the cost benefit analysis that we've done in the project. Program manual, health exams, work with other districts, a lot of instructional tools, including measuring observable scales of classroom adjustment, based on observational tools of engagement. All these follow-on projects came about because of the CLS and the success that we had. And obviously, there's differences between the programs, but I do want to point out a lesson that we compare and replicate the studies. The interesting finding is that let's look at the effect size in Cohen's D between the MCPC scale-up that I developed and the CLS CPC. And let's look at the effect size on school readiness skills, dosage, end of kindergarten, end of third grade parent involvement. They're almost identical, which is amazing to me. The other thing to keep in mind is that in the new versions, CPC scale-up, the enhanced version of the CPC program, the school reform model, the comparison group are kids getting regular pre-K, Head Start or state pre-K in Chicago or St. Paul as well. So the comparison group is getting, a 4-star program. With CPC, you're getting a 5-star program. So that comparison even holds when you have a great intervention even on the control group side. So that's reassuring for replication expansion that we can scale this, and that's also a lesson too for the future that we can scale these effectiveness elements. And obviously, a lot of new approaches we developed in the study that we couldn't have done without the kind of the sample and the success and the follow-up as well. I will only point out this 5,000 model is an interesting focus on mechanisms, and then this whole model, like confirmatory program evaluation, you can see lots of other things there. I won't dwell on them. And the last thing is, if we think about programs today, I think about this as a first decade model, okay? And I think about this as we know these essential elements, effectiveness elements that give programs their impact in the beginning. And we know there's this supportive environment here. If we can get a supportive climate of environment, organizational context, whether it's schools or communities, strong principle, and we embed it within a first decade program model with the key elements of success, and we have these larger community factors that can support learning, then we have a structure that we can develop and scale in an effective way. And so I think that's ultimately where we want to go, scale these elements. And I think the success in implementing sort of the elements, the implications, these 7 kind of key points, if we do that, as I'm sort of suggesting, and we think bigger, scale up, and also bigger beyond pre-K itself, I think we can get there and be even more successful in the future. Thank you. Sorry for taking 16 minutes, wherever it was.
No, that was great. was perfect. So thank you both, Steve and Art. I'm going to make a few comments that focus sort of on the critical importance of these studies to the field of early childhood education, and some of the legacy that they've left, or lessons for more contemporary studies that are getting started. And then I'm going to open things up for Q&A. So the first thing I want to do is just commend the teams that undertook both studies. They designed and implemented research that was just enormously challenging and has really become both inspirational and foundational in guiding the research, practice, and policy that has followed. I mean, an astounding thing on the side for both studied, especially Perry, a lot of that study was done pre-internet. Just think of the amazing work that was done. And I think Chicago Longitudinal Study, CBC, was started pre-internet as well. They were among the first studies to document the enormous impact that high-quality early childhood education could have on early childhood development. And really, they just stand without parallel in terms of documenting the long-term sustained value for adult attainment and well-being. I think of both of them as being really ubiquitous references and the kinds of papers, proposals, presentations, the things that we do that make an argument for the value of public funding for ECE and family and community investment in ECE. That $7 to $1 cost benefit ratio, I think I have it in everything I write. Don't forget, look at what was shown in those early amazing studies. In addition, I think the findings from these studies really provide unique and irreplaceable evidence documenting the value of ECE relative in the Perry Preschool to no ECE, which really documents what a whole new vision of ECE could bring, and in arts to existing community-based programs. I think that as we move forward and the landscape of ECE is sort of constantly changing, the commonalities of the findings in these early longitudinal studies sort of stand to document the ongoing value and mechanisms, the way in which ECE contributes to development. So both of these studies have things in common. They both represented sort of multifaceted and theory-driven approaches to ECE. They both address basic questions about impact. What are the long-term benefits of ECE for those individuals who participated, but also additional questions about mechanisms of action that sort of guide us to understand more about how is ECE working. At the same time, the designs were pretty different, and I want to talk a little bit about some of those distinguishing factors and how they maybe provide both common and diverging legacies and lessons for ongoing research. So when I think about Perry, Steve will be able to fill in if I get any of this wrong, but I think about a lot of the design of that program was in developing very high quality programming. There was tremendous theoretical roots in the constructive models of early childhood development, and the design with which the approach to teaching was sort of articulated and supported. We still have a legacy. The high school program that was core to the development of Perry Preschool, exists and is widely used today. It was sort of a value on what happens during the day, how teachers use their time, the professional development and expertise of teachers, and the importance of guiding the use of the day, both in terms of content and the process. I think that the unique emphasis that program placed on home learning honestly gets lost in a lot of the current applications. So that 90 minutes that well-certified, qualified teachers went into homes to illustrate for parents how they could support their kids' development. I think that, in my way of thinking, was probably a pretty critical element, especially for some of the sustained effects we see. I think the legacy we see, the roots of this focus in current research, is we have a number of studies that are really focused on the programming, developing more of the programming that happens during the day in ECE centers. So we have this emerging evidence on domain-specific curriculum components, that the way you teach and the content of that teaching may increase the impact on children's school readiness. I think that understanding more about that and some of the dismantling studies that maybe pull apart from the multifaceted what impact we're getting from different dimensions is an important legacy that again Perry has the lead in. The Chicago Parent Child Center model to me is interesting because I think of it as quite a contrast. There's much less of a specific classroom program and more of a focus on sort of the structural and functional components that are critical to ECE programming. So there's more emphasis on sort of things like the way the leadership team is organized, the way that the parent involvement activities are designed, and the sort of structures that must exist to fit the CPC model. I think that there's more of a community involvement in constructing the content in the CPC model, that it needs to fit into that structural and functional framework, but it's not like you're all going to do the high scope model. There is more variability there. I see the legacy there as maybe being one that is more open to how our current concerns about how are we going to address more context specific needs, make room for more culturally relevant programming. The CPC model is sort of set up to allow for that. I think another really valuable thing about that model, Art, is the way that you've designed this model of the mechanisms, not just of the immediate impact of the intervention on child outcomes, but what some of the supporting structures might be doing in terms of long-term impacts. So I think of the Chicago Longitudinal Study as one of the few that have said, hey, we better look at what families are doing as a mechanism for long-term sustainable impact. We need to look at how alignment across school years and across homeschool components, what role they're playing. To me, the models that we see going on now, we're increasingly seeing interest in sort of scalability of models. Publicly funded pre-K programs. Chris Weiland, I don't know if she's on, but her research is a good example of this. How do we scale that to fit the variety of community-based preschools that are also providing that kind of a programming? And, it's really, that research is really suggesting even the same program can have different impacts in different contexts. We don't understand much about that. That's going to take this sort of more broader modeling that includes the context and some of the functional maybe components that mechanisms that are driving long-term outcomes. And at the same time, I think we've got to keep in mind both kinds of research, both this focus on the way that we can improve programming and the way that we can improve understanding of both context-based influences, longitudinal influences, and structures that are critical for producing these effects. Both of those are going to be really valuable. I do think that there are challenges, as you've mentioned, in the way that new longitudinal designs can be done. To my mind, one of the unfortunate things is a lot of that research has been limited to, are we keeping achievement over a short-term period? And I think we will be better off if people take heart from the studies you two have done to look more broadly at what are the conditions under which we're seeing sustained effects on achievement, and what are the other kinds of factors that are being influenced by ECE programming that might also be critical to producing longer term impacts. I think that's going to be so important. I think one advantage that current researchers have are there are much more of these nationally representative longitudinal samples. So I see some really interesting longitudinal work now coming out of data sets like the ECHOLS, where people are creatively using available data to try to test models of both subgroup kinds of models of who's benefiting in what ways and what's driving the developmental cascade model, what's driving that. I think also there are studies that are a little bit more like Perry, where the focus has been on very in-depth programming and looking at that, how those are affecting longitudinal outcomes. Our work on the READY program is an example of that. So I hope that people don't feel discouraged about some of the differences, but more see that these studies are guidance for how to look forward, and the extent to which we see commonalities across them in terms of the mechanisms and driving, that's really lessons for the field about what we need to pay attention to in forward momentum. All right, I want to go ahead and stop talking. So there's an opportunity for our audience to get involved in Q&A with the speakers.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Karen, Arthur, and Steve for sharing your expertise. I'm Janelle. I help coordinate the Big Ten Early Learning Alliance, and I'm just hopping on to help field the questions that we have coming in. So first, there's a question: what, if any, longitudinal projects beginning at birth have been done?
Two big, one of the things to understand, these are really programmatic sets of research. Arthur talked about that. There's follow-on studies to Perry that people don't seem to even know about. I don't think they know enough about Arthur's follow-on studies with the Midwest Child Parent Centers. But Abecedarian is a well-known example. Less well-known, I think equally important, is the Infant Health and Development Program, which is it starts at birth and followed kids well into the adult years.
You also have Nurse Family Partnership, David Oll's work in home visiting programs. A lot of child abuse prevention programs started at birth, and there's a lot of those, out there.
Yeah. Having said that, I think, working with the health field to launch some birth cohort studies in the United States comparable to what they've had in the UK, for example, and having early childhood education, child development be a strong part of that would be huge.
Definitely. Yeah, I think the integration of health, education, child welfare is really important. Needs to be more on that.
All right, thank you. Next question. Given the strong causal evidence from these two studies, is this established science, or do we need to conduct similar studies given the changing demographics and context of the U.S.?
Well, I think if you look at the knowledge, certainly we have the evidence, there's a foundation of kind of generalizable knowledge. And if we take that evidence and we sort of apply it to the current landscape, I mean, it helps sort of reinforce and really be able to take that knowledge and examine, different subgroups, different communities, different levels of scale, and to see if we have sort of consistency. I am sort of amazed just looking at the studies here, whether, Abbott and Perry, CPC, you've got the Michigan Great State Readiness Program, all these, sort of programs that have long-term follow-up data. If they're high in quality, you see, pretty decent effect sizes in third or fourth grade. And we're finding in the scale of the CPC, at least, effect sizes relative to regular or like 4-star pre-K programs of 0.3 to 0.4 in different contexts and different years. And so you're building a case for causal knowledge. And of course, there's always new contexts that are implementing programs. So you're going to take that and hopefully reinforce it as you go along. Well, but I think there's a lot of consistency and synergy in the findings, but we still need to take it more to scale. So we can look at this at a population level, like we can in the health fields, like, all families, have their kids immunized. most kids, you know, go to kindergarten, 90% as well. But again, we still need to see this in total population universal sense to see where we're getting and how the quality matters. And it certainly does.
And I would just add, I mean, certainly these studies are solid scientific evidence, but they hardly answer every question that we need to
Right.
understand
Sure.
to be able to provide all children with high quality ECE. So there's all kinds of issues about accessibility and disparities in that access, in exactly what are the most strategic ways to build quality. Um, we have lessons to learn in workforce development and professional development models. We have lessons to learn in curriculum and programming, in the issues of scaling and how to get similar results across settings. So there's lots of questions for contemporary researchers.
Definitely. Yeah, we find, because when we did the scale up of the CPC program, this is working with 5 districts back in 2012. I mean, taking a model as well, and people were like retiring, and there's massive changes that were occurring in the systems. Chicago, closed 50 schools during the first year of the scale up project. What I learned there was that if you develop sort of a co-ownership model, engagement co-ownership model with communities and schools, that makes a huge difference in scaling and in also understanding the new things that we need to better understand in terms of accessibility, what Karen is saying. But I think you need that strong supportive environment of engagement. And that to me, that was not present, in the 60s and 70s. Maybe in the Great Society area it was, but again, a lot of these projects started out is really, let's just follow the samples, but it's not necessarily, let's create new communities to have a population-wide, a universal strategy for supportive interventions over the first decade of life. That came much later. And I think that's one of the lessons. So people need to feel like they're owning everything that's happening. And it's not, researchers can't do that by themselves. And I don't
And
even
getting
think of myself as a researcher in this work. It's like engaging with communities.
and getting policymakers to do
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
with right. Not, I don't want to study a mediocre preschool program at age 4 anymore.
Right.
All right. Hey, what are we going to learn from that? Nothing that I think advances. What would a truly strong public program look like from birth through age 10? Can we get somebody to do that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we have several questions coming in about translating this for policymakers and advocates. So I'm trying to think of how to summarize, but I think a good one here is what guidance would you give for policymakers or advocates using this data? And in particular, are there any misuses of the results you've seen that you would caution against?
I think we all know the misuse of, like, yeah, 7 to 1, not going to happen from most of what politicians do based on wishful thinking. Just, you're going to be lucky to get 1 for 1 out of a lot of this. And I'm not sure with good precision, the estimated impacts of a lot of public preschool programs are near zero. And people don't want to face up to that. They're not at all like what we're talking about. They're not systemic. They're not sustained. They're not of the intensity. They're not coherent with school reform from K through 3. Right? The notion that you're going to get the same thing out of that is just silly. So
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think the other thing to realize, I think it's not necessarily a linear model. I think my interest in, I think of Perry and CPC, certainly they're 5-star programs. If you can only have 5 stars, they're definitely 5-star programs. But I think a lot of the run-of-the-mill programs Steve's talking about, I mean, there's 4-star programs out there. I'm seeing that the added value you get with an outstanding program is huge. So going from a 3 to 4, 4 to 5-star program makes a huge difference because our project was set up to fail in the scale up because we were comparing Illinois State Pre-K program, which is pretty good program, well implemented Head Start programs with public school teachers that are paid on the same scale as district teachers. And we're finding large effects above and beyond that as well. And so to me, it's the value of going the extra mile, paying more per child, get the 5-star program as close as you can, and you're going to see the benefits. And also don't stop in pre-K though. I think the follow-on effects, the P3 effects are real. And we're seeing that certainly in CPC. And I think the challenge is the cost factor is large to do this well, to align, and to provide the same services, same class sizes, in K-3 as pre-K is very difficult and it has to be funded. So I think we need to make a better case for that. But the misuse is absolutely, are you going to get the same benefits from a 2-star, 3-star program? There's no ways, but let's go for the max.
And piling on to what Arthur said, right, that the inverse of this is that we don't need to worry that we're overinvesting in early childhood. The payoff to what seems really expensive is huge. That's what Arthur just said. I'm just, packaging it slightly differently. That point just does not get across.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Again, lots of questions about how to make this land with decision makers. A specific one here is about the parental engagement component that Arthur was speaking about. Martha says, in many states such as mine, Indiana, policymakers remain committed to the children need to be home with their parents' mindset. As an advocate, I see an opportunity to use the parental involvement component to form connections to the policymakers. What parts of the parent involvement component should I focus on when engaging with this mindset?
I think one thing we learned was that when we were doing the scale up project, and the thing as well, because I was doing this as like an intervene, like as a designer developer, kind of helping schools and working with parents and teachers, which I did a lot in this scale up. So I wasn't really in a research capacity when I was doing this work. But what we designed and what was encouraging that it was a menu-based system of family involvement, or parent involvement that was developed because in the older days of the CPC program, it was school involvement. That's what you got credit for. It wasn't necessarily home involvement. But we realized that is mistaken in some ways because you got much different career trajectories and interests among moms and dads out there. And so you need a home visiting component, a family engagement component. You need a way that however families are comfortable getting involved in their children's education or the school, it's there. So the menu system allows you to customize that as long as you're doing at least some. We found that phenomenally successful because if you have a system, a team, like a navigator or an outreach worker that's working on behalf of the families or also still encouraging school involvement, that you have sort of a lot of different recipes that you can develop as well. And so that includes parents also engaging with policymakers and becoming involved in governance and advocacy. That's part of the parent involvement that you're having. So all that's counted. And so if you implement that well, and I say in this co-ownership model with schools and teachers and family service staff that you're working with, that can be phenomenally successful. And so I think it's so we need to think about mapping parent engagement on with what families can actually do given the time they have during the day. Not everyone's going to go on field trips, so you have to design a program that way.
These the more of these multiple pathways that Arthur has outlined that you hit, the more robust your effort is going to be in terms of variations in the children served, variations in the context that lead to variations in outcomes. And they're intersecting and reinforcing, right? So that as many of these as you can hit, as hard as you can hit them, you're going to have more robust program impacts, I think.
And the only thing I would add to that is I think that parent outreach is a great example of where contemporary researchers can make a big difference because the evidence of how parent involvement, the way it's done in most centers, you have a parent visitation day, you send some handouts home. Not much evidence that actually matters. There has to be a more intensive and intentional effort to involve and align parents. So it's a whole another field of research, but one in which the programming itself needs to be enriched with science to maximize its impact.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, we're at 101, so thanks for staying a minute extra with us. And yeah, thank you again to Arthur, Steve, and Karen for sharing your expertise with us all. Karen, I'm taking the end of the spiel since I am on, but
Thank you, Janelle.
once you click exit or end, you'll be redirected to a really short survey that will help us inform future events. So please take the time to fill that out. And if you did not get your question answered and it is burning in your mind, I'll write my email in the chat. I can help get you connected with these folks. So thank you for attending and thank you again for sharing with us all.